No one wants their voice silenced. That can be pretty much said for everybody. However, those who are passionate about their voice being heard are typically artists and creators in general. Whether it's because of the inherent narcissism we all hold or something else entirely, creators have this inherent need to have their words heard by the world. Paradoxically, the entertainment industry to which most of us are drawn to is some of the most heavily scrutinized in terms of creative expression. And you'd be remiss to think otherwise. But this sphere of creative censorship has been around in the entertainment industry since movies were still referred to as talkies. One would think, with the industry being well over 100 years old, that censorship constraints would have loosened by now. It is, in fact, quite the opposite. Probably the most famous example of entertainment censorship in the United States happened back in the late 40s and early 50s with the Hollywood blacklist. With the growing fear of communism sweeping the United States post-World War II, the House of Representatives deemed it essential to stomp out any potential communist sympathizers. Thus, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was created in 1938. Their mission plan was to investigate any alleged disloyal and potentially rebellious activities on part of private citizens, public employees, and/or organizations suspected of having communist ties. For some paranoid reason, some in the government thought Hollywood was attempting to sneak communist propaganda into their films, and thus called multiple Hollywood actors, writers, and executives before a HUAC committee to prove their innocence. If they were deemed to be a communist sympathizer, then they would be prohibited from returning to the film industry. In 1947, 10 members of the film industry publicly denounced the actions of HUAC and refused to testify. They were known as the Hollywood 10. Their reasoning for their lack of cooperation was that they believed that the HUAC's probing was a violation of their rights. Because of this, each of the men was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison for contempt of Congress, which is defined as the act of obstructing the work of the United States Congress. Not only that, they were charged with a $1,000 fine, which is roughly equivalent to $13,000 in 2022. Interestingly enough, one of the few who testified to HUAC about potential communist sympathizers was actually Walt Disney, which you'll find quite ironic later in this video. Regardless, many actors, writers, and directors were completely shunned from the industry. In fact, many of the blacklisted writers had to write under a pen name in order to continue working. If you're looking for further information on this or what it was like for screenwriters during this time, I highly recommend watching the movie Trumbo starring Bryan Cranston. In the movie, Cranston plays Dalton Trumbo, who was one of the members of the Hollywood 10. It follows his life as a screenwriter and how he was affected by being called before the court, and his life after being blacklisted. Regardless, during this time, in order to have national security, the government forfeited the personal freedoms of American citizens. The House of Un-American Activities Committee was eventually dissolved in 1975, and thus the blacklist was lifted. This was really the first act of governmental censorship on the entertainment industry. Anyone who could possibly be a communist was kicked out of Hollywood or potentially sent to prison for having differing opinions. Essentially, people in the entertainment industry, and really everyone in America, temporarily had their First Amendment rights stripped for their own good. Since the time of HUAC, the government has lifted its foot from the entertainment industry's neck. Later, it was Hollywood itself that decided to place more restrictions on itself. In 1968, the Motion Picture Association of America, or MPAA, began placing ratings on their films for parents to determine if the film was suitable for their children. However, this rating system is completely voluntary. There is no law requiring filmmakers to submit their films to the MPAA for rating. What's really interesting, though, is that the board members are made up of parents who aren't even in the entertainment industry. And these board members have been accused of being more lenient with their ratings and criticisms of major film studios as opposed to independent films. Since the introduction of film ratings, movies can be greatly impacted solely due to that factor. Money is everything to Hollywood, and PG-13 is by far the most profitable rating. More often than not, scripts are chopped up and forced to adapt to a PG-13 rating. Hollywood sacrifices creative freedom for profit. In addition, the MPAA rating system is strange, to say the least. In a PG-13 movie, you can include 2 uses of the F word as long as they are not used in a sexual way. If there are 3 uses, then the movie instantly becomes rated R. However, if the movie includes a scene of a man getting stabbed, killed, or brutally beaten to death, As long as there's no blood, it's totally fine for a PG-13 rating. So the MPAA deems it more appropriate for children to see brutal killings as long as there's no blood, but if a bad word is said one too many times, it's deemed inappropriate. For reference, two of my favorite movies of all time are Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight and Jon Favreau's Chef. One movie is about a brutal murderer who enters Gotham City killing indiscriminately in order to cause chaos and destruction to the city and bring an end to Batman. The other is about a chef who not only lost his creative freedom by working in a strict kitchen, but lost his connection with his son. He then decides to open up a food truck and go on a cross-country road trip with his son and best friend, selling cubanos in order to reconnect with his son and rediscover his love for cooking. Can you guess which one was rated R? Well, it's not the one where a man gets a pencil stabbed through his face, I can tell you that much. These strange rating systems limit creative freedom and drastically financially limit movies that dare step out of line. As I said before, Hollywood is all about money. Creative integrity be damned. Perhaps the most egregious offender of censorship in Hollywood is none other than the Walt Disney Company. Disney has an extremely strict policy when it comes to their films, and I'm not talking about their animated movies. Those movies are clearly made for kids, and to my knowledge, there isn't a cut of Frozen where Elsa drops an F-bomb. What I'm talking about is sacrificing creative and moral integrity in order for profit. When Disney was releasing Star Wars Episodes 7, 8, and 9, they greatly diminished the presence of John Boyega, who plays the character of Finn, one of the three main characters in the movie, on all of the posters in China. Also, a scene where two women kiss in the background of Episode 9 was also cut for the Chinese release. When releasing Black Panther, the Chinese poster didn't show Chadwick Boseman's face. In the first Doctor Strange, the Temple of Kamar-Taj is located in Nepal, despite it appearing in Tibet in the comics. They changed it to appease the Chinese government, which claims sovereignty over Tibet, much like they do with Taiwan. In fact, in Iron Man 3, there's an extended scene they filmed exclusively for the Chinese release where Tony Stark gets his arc reactor removed from his chest, specifically by Chinese surgeons. There are far more examples of Disney censoring their movies stateside and overseas in order to appease a foreign government, all on the basis of financial gain, but you get my point. In order to enter a non-American market and increase their revenue, they will sacrifice their own morals for profit and turn around and boast to America how much they support the Black and LGBT communities. When a writer or creative in general is allowed to express their own opinions freely, then their final product will likely be much better. Time and time again, studios full of executives who know next to nothing about narrative and story structure will forcibly change movies to appease a statistic for profit. It doesn't matter if said thing doesn't work in the script. If it's popular enough, whatever it may be, the studio financing the film will force it in or out of the final script. Just look at David Ayer's 2016 film Suicide Squad. It was originally much darker, gritty, and somber in tone. However, when Warner Bros. Sent off the film to be cut into a trailer, which is done by a separate company not affiliated with the filmmakers, they cut it to appear much more lighthearted and comedic, completely going against what was already filmed. The general populace reacted very positively to this new tone, and WB itself liked the change of pace so much that they reportedly spent $22 million in reshoots to match the tone of the trailers. The final product was an amalgamation of conflicting tones, strange musical cues, and a total waste of fantastic actors. Well, some fantastic actors. This happens extremely often in Hollywood. The studio, 9 times out of 10, has the final say in everything. Unless you're Tom Cruise, who can simply make a call on his lunch break to Paramount Pictures telling them that they're going to make Top Gun Maverick, which is actually what happened, by the way, then you're out of luck. Censorship in Hollywood is a serious problem. New creatives are being ignored in the name of profit, archaic rating systems, and whatever the statistic now says. The result is the same movie being made over and over and over and over and over again. Just look at the top 10 highest grossing films in 2021. 9 out of 10 of those films are sequels. While the United States government may have relaxed their censorship of Hollywood, it's now Hollywood's own fault for censoring itself. There may be examples of positive studio intervention. For instance, Peter Jackson only pitched Lord of the Rings to be made in 2 movies. It was actually the studio that wanted 3, which worked out in the end because there were 3 books. In contrast, it was also the studio that wanted The Hobbit to be broken up into 3 movies, despite only being 1 book. So there's a give and take here. I'm sure there are plenty of other stories of positive studio intervention that worked out in the end, but it's the disasters that make the headlines. Regardless, when a creative is allowed to freely express themselves, they can make some of the most thought-provoking and fantastic pieces of media out there. When not beholden to statistics or governmental guidelines, the creative will most likely create something far more entertaining in the end. With creative freedom, they can criticize and support whomever they want and show what they deem necessary to the story without fear of upsetting a tone-deaf studio executive. With more individual freedoms, everything turns out better in the end. But, unfortunately, if it's creative and not profitable, it, sadly, more than likely, won't be made in the end.